Hello, welcome, and I do have two CBM 8050s now, together with my PET 3016. Both of these things you have already seen. The PET 3016 has a couple of upgrades inside to make it basically a 3032. I'm not sure if that ever existed, but it now has 32 kilobytes of RAM, which makes it a lot more useful than a 16K machine, which is still quite a lot less than the Commodore 64, obviously. And why do I have two drives? Well, the CBM 8050 I restored in a previous video, and it mostly works. It was in very good condition. However, these drives are both from 1983, so 41 years old, and the right drive here, the drive 0 of this thing, is slightly damaged. I think I might be able to repair it. However, it's very hard to get into this thing. I will have to drill some, what do you call those, rivets out, and didn't want to risk damaging it further. It does work a little bit, but not perfectly. The left side works flawlessly. But for what I want to demonstrate with the PET, I need drive 0, and I don't simply want to swap them around. So along came this drive for relatively little money, considering that these go for amazing prices nowadays. But this thing was in a terrible condition, probably stored for decades in a damp environment, maybe a cellar or something, basement. And it was very crusty inside, a lot of things were rusted. I meticulously cleaned it and lubricated everything, because most of the stuff was actually looking fine, and we can later look inside perhaps. You can see my repair thread on Mastodon if you want. I didn't make a video out of this because it was basically archaeology work, and the floppy videos usually tend to not go that well, so I basically just posted to all my followers on Patreon, not on Patreon, on Mastodon. And that's that. So does this thing work now? It has some issues, but the right drive works insofar as I can write data and read data. It cannot format disks, so there's still an issue. The left drive I haven't really tested because I don't care. The software that we want to run is written in such a way that it can only use the right drive. So I have this half working, and eventually I hope to get both in perfect working order. But that's for another time, as I said. This is just a side project to get this running. Because, let's put this over here, the Commodore PET is from an era where text displays were king. This is a business machine, Commodore Business Machine, CBM. And yeah, you weren't supposed to play on it. However, I thought this machine is from 1979. What kind of games would there have been in 1979, or maybe the early 80s, like 1983, that are not graphics games? Well, obviously, for example, the Infocom text adventures. Here is, for example, Planetfall. That is also on this diskette here. The box here is from the Atari version, I think. What does it say? This is for the 800 or the 8-bit series, because it requires a 48K and an 810 or 1050 disc, which probably means that this is for the 400 and 800 series. And there's even the disc inside here, which is maybe even broken by now, but we have the box at least. And then there is hibernated one for the IBM PC in this case, but it comes with an SD card with all the versions. And on the back side of this floppy disk, because these are single-sided, you can have flippy disks, just like on the 1541. we have Hibernated 1 by Stefan Vogt. This is a 2022 or 21 game, so a couple of years old. And there's also other modern-ish games that are based on the Infocom Z3 version of their interpreter, which perhaps could be run on this machine. The thing is, it already says here 48K required, and all the Infocom games usually require around 48K. However, there is one very clever person by the name of BitShifter. He wrote an interpreter for the PET. There's also the Osmo interpreter, which can be used on a lot of 8-bit platforms. But the BitShifter's interpreter is the only one that works on the Commodore PET with 32K of RAM. However, 32K is really cutting it close, and some of the larger games, which have a little bit larger data files than Planetfall and Hibernated 1, won't run at all. So more memory is actually a good thing. And we have to take a short look at the memory map of the Commodore PET. And it usually doesn't allow for more than 32K of RAM, because the upper half is for ROM. But let's have a look inside of this thing and see what we can do about it to get these games to perform better, because more memory means more part of the game can be kept in memory, or even more games can be played that have larger story files. Okay, I hope you can make this out roughly. This is the PET memory map, a simplified version obviously, of which are taken from Tynemouth Software's blog. He is, I think, pretty much an expert on the PET and similarly old Commodore machines. And it shows the different models, the 2001, the 3016, the 4032 and the 8032, and what their memory layout looks like. We have 64 kilobytes, so the address range is from 000 to FFFF, and these are all little segments of 1K, I think. Actually, that should be 4K. Probably, yeah, 4K. Exactly, those are 4K segments. Very nice. The 2001, the very first PET, only had 8K of RAM at the lower range, then 1K of video RAM for 40 by 25 characters, and a bunch of ROMs. The 3016 that we have here has BASIC 2.0, which means it has 4 ROMs. There is the kernel ROM that is also existing on the C64, for example, and the basic ROM. So we have 4K ROM here, 2K ROM there, and 2 other 4K ROMs. And in this segment, I think there's also an I/O area for devices. There's the 1K of video RAM in that segment, and we have 3 option ROMs, 4K option ROMs. We will open up the machine in a second, and there you will see 3 empty sockets where you could put in additional software on ROMs. Those were often dongles for copy-protected software, or those would be utilities or whatever, the core program, for example, for a word processor or something like that. The 4032 and 8032 required an additional 4K basic for the basic 4.0, which would make one of the option ROMs go away, namely the one in the B segment. The interpreter that we're using requires BASIC 4.0 or the corresponding kernel, to be quite exact, to be running. So we lose the option to use this B segment ROM, and yeah, that is the case basically. And I'm doing this not by replacing the ROM chips itself, but by using a RAM-ROM emulator basically, which you will also see in a second. I've done a video on that a couple of years back. So this thing has been running with BASIC 4.0, but I can switch off this ROMulator and then I have basic 2.0, which is quite nice. So I can go back to stock on this 3016 pretty easily. But what's all this talk about the ROM, you say? Well, for one, I just got the idea that you could perhaps put the interpreter into the ROM and gain a bit of RAM, for that matter. But there's even a better version. There is something called the SoftROM. It's a little expansion that fits into one of the option ROM sockets and that you can use to gain 8 kilobytes of extra ROM, like by using an EEPROM or an SRAM or something like that. And you can put anything in there. However, the pinout of SRAM chips and EEPROM chips is very similar. So what is actually currently in here, and I will show you in a second, is an expansion with 8 kilobyte of SRAM, so static RAM that doesn't need a refresh, that can be used, and that is taking up these two segments, the 9000 and the 8000 segment in the PET. And BitShifter was kind enough to patch his interpreter for the Infocom games to use that range for its cache, basically to, like smart drive on MS-DOS or something, a disk cache basically, so that sectors that have already been loaded don't have to be loaded again, which should speed up things significantly. Also, the cache is always there, so we gain memory to run larger stories, which is amazing. So let's have a look inside. Let's take a look at the RAM-ROM expansion, which we need for the basic 4, and the SoftROM expansion, which gives us another 8K. And not only the interpreter can use that, you can use it even from basic. You can peek and poke stuff into there if you want to have extra data or something. And you can write your own software that uses that. Just testing if you can write into that region and read back data, and then you know, okay, there's a memory expansion there. So usually in the ROM, of course, you can't write, and if you try to write into that area, you will read back a different value. But now, let's open up the PET and have a look. Okay, this is what a PET 3016 looks like from the inside. This is one of the boards that doesn't use the CRTC, the display controller yet, but does it by having a lot of TTL chips here. And the rough construction here is you have the power supply on the left with a big capacitor, another big capacitor here. The AC comes in here. There's a bunch of rectifier diodes, and there's also a bunch of linear regulators over here, producing all kinds of voltages for +5, -5, and 12 volts. There is the 32K of RAM here, which I replaced in a previous episode. There's the RAM and ROM emulator up here. It does have its own 32K of SRAM, which I don't use because my machine isn't running stable with that SRAM. No idea why, but probably down to some timing issues. The SRAM itself is just fine, but it produces arbitrary memory issues. So I'm using original old DRAMs here, which I like much better anyway. The 6502 from 1979 is on here as well. Plus there is a flash EEPROM basically, which I can toggle with these dip switches. So I can turn it off and have basic 2.0, which is incidentally in these 4 chips. So there's also, of course, I think there's a character ROM, which might be this one here. I think this is the screen RAM maybe even. And one of these is the kernel, I think, plus the rest is probably basic. And there are 3 more ROM slots, which is for the option ROMs. This option ROM here is empty because this would be populated for basic 4. However, here in this socket here, which is for the 9000 segment, and this is for the 8000 segment, is the SoftROM expansion. I will link to that if I can in the video description. Yeah, I think there's a homepage for that. there are Gerber files available, I think. It's a relatively simple thing. There's one TTL chip under that SRAM chip. There's a resistor pack and 2 diodes, Zener diodes on there, plus 1 capacitor, I think. And I think that's it. Maybe there's one more resistor or something. Plus there are some lead wires here that go to the memory expansion slot. So there is a kind of expansion from factory that you could use to upgrade the PET. And I think it goes onto the memory bus, but there's no need, as I could replace all the chips on here anyway. So this is the extra 8K. What else is there to see? I think there's a VIA up here or something, or 2 maybe. So the construction is relatively similar to the VIC-20, for example, except that it doesn't have the VIC chip, but uses all this TTL logic for driving the display, which incidentally is this connector here. This drives the CRT, and yeah, this here is the keyboard connector, which goes to the keyboard up here that you can't see. And that's already everything there is on the Commodore PET. It's a very minimalistic machine. It was basically one of the first real personal computers, all in one box that you could just unpack and start to use. And yeah, one interesting tidbit here is, as the ROM slots here are for 4K only, but there's of course enough address pins here to address more. There's only one wire going to the second ROM slot here, to the 8000, which is the chip select signal. So basically this chip here listens to both the chip select for this slot and for this slot, effectively giving us the opportunity to use both the 9000 and the 8000 segment. The idea being that there's some decoding logic here that selects the different slots depending on which address is currently on the bus. For example, this would be chip select would be activated if the address is in the range of 9000 to 9FFF, and this here from 8000 to AFFFF, and so on. B segment, C segment, D, E, and F. And that's the whole idea. So very simple mechanism, and a very nice trick to have one wire going into the chip select pin here. But enough talking. I would say we can fire up the machine now and try to do a little bit of benchmarking. I must say I've already tried this with the SD card, and with the SD card everything is very super fast, but I do want to have the experience how it would have been in 1979 or 1983, depending on which year you pick, to sit here and play a game from floppy disks. So let's have a very quick look inside of the 8050. If you have watched my previous video, it should be relatively, well, the same, so to speak. This 8050 is almost the same as the other one. There are a couple of differences. One was this thing here, which is an RF filter, which was on the mains input right before the power switch actually. And this was also a problem because it exploded while the device was turned off. And this happens to all of these filters after 40 years. So before you turn on any of these devices, or even plug in any of these devices, check them if they have this thing. Of course, you need to know what you're doing. This is mains voltage, so things apply. If you don't know what you're doing, leave your hands off of it and let someone do this that knows what they are doing. Luckily, my breaker box tripped, and so nothing happened, because this thing really makes a short basically, and it was just fuming a bit, but was totally fine afterwards. It did leave a scorch mark basically from the soot that escaped, but that's it. Cutting this out and rewiring everything made this whole thing work again. And let us zoom in a little bit so you can see perhaps a little bit better. This is the main board, which houses the two 6502s. I've replaced the linear regulators with the good low noise switching variants that I've also shown in a different video. The problem was mainly that all the metal parts here, which are I think made of aluminum maybe, were corroded. So I cleaned them very, very thoroughly and treated them with some kind of deoxide. So I have a little bit of oil coating on there as well to keep further corrosion from happening, because in theory you would need to electroplate everything again, I think, but for that I would need to disassemble the whole thing, but didn't want to do that. The drive mechanisms themselves are made by MPI, not by Micropolis, but they're compatible with the Micropolis. So the analog board here is the same as the Micropolis one. So they are interchangeable, which is nice. There's also a tandem variant, which I don't have. There's this little extra board here on drive 1, which is not the case on the Micropolis boards. So you would have to swap around both drives, I think. Most probably. That's roughly it. The transformer still works fine. It has a little bit of rust here, but that should be more or less passive, and as long as I keep this thing dry, it should work. There are replacement transformers available, modern ones that I could swap in there that gives us the correct voltages, but I didn't bother doing that so far because it just works. As it is, the windings are all good still. I also checked all the ground leads that they have proper connection and that there's no short in the transformer itself. So that's nice. I lubricated the motors and all the bearings because they were totally gummed up. So after a lot of cleaning, this thing now roughly works. I still have to calibrate this drive and, as I said, figure out why the formatting doesn't work on this drive. But that being said, we can close this back up, which is quite nice. And yeah, let's turn our attention to the SoftROM. So the PET is up and running using BASIC 4.0, which is required for the Infocom interpreter. 31 kilobytes of free memory. The BASIC is done using the ROM emulator. The RAM is actual true old memory on the main board. We look at the directory of the disk drive 0 and we see there is the story file that can have any name but has to start with Z and has to be a sequential file, I think. Then there's the interpreter by BitShifter and the patched interpreter with the SoftROM support for the cache. They are basically the same size, it just changes where in memory the cache is located. We will first load the original interpreter and time how long it takes until the story has loaded, and also get a little bit of a feel how this whole thing is working out. Then let's have a look. I will try and time this starting now. And that's where the story has loaded, but you have to press return in a second. It says where the program itself is loaded. All the programs start at hex address 401 on the PET. It goes to 1FFF, so that's 28 pages. Story file has been loaded from 2700 to 4CFF. Cache is 4DFF to 7FF, 51 pages. There is 0 RAM page, it says, at the moment at least, and the story file itself is 355. However, I think here it loaded everything, the story file, the 38 pages that it could, and there's a disk cache that has been pre-filled, it seems, as well, up to 7F00, probably also FF, I think that's only the start address. So let's press return and see how fast the story starts. There we go. Until the first more prompt appears, that's our time. And pressing return also takes just a second or something. The game will load every time you enter a command. For example, the first thing you have to do here is open your eyes, and the disk on the side fires off, loading the reaction basically that happens, or the game code that is triggered when you do this, which takes surprisingly long. However, as you have to read all the text, which describes the hibernation chamber and your setting, it's actually not that terrible. And I think this definitely decelerates your gaming experience a bit. Not by too much. The whirring of the floppy drive is, of course, quite audible. But yeah, the game definitely works. However, now let's restart the machine and check to see if we can also do this with the SoftROM and compare how fast both are. Okay, so the PET SoftROM version is loaded. The loading time of both are of course the same. I will hit run and enter and we'll sync it up with the other load so I can put it side by side so we can see if any of this is actually faster. Probably this one will be slower because it will fill more memory, I think. But we can then check how fast it actually works when running the game. There we go. Now I'll press return and try to resync again with the video that we took before. And here we are. Let's press return once more, and there it didn't load anything anymore. Let's do the open eyes again and also sync up and see. Here we are at the more prompt. I don't think there's probably much of a difference, but we'll see in post-production. But it definitely works, and my hope would be that slightly larger games are also possible now on this machine that hadn't been possible before. Other than that, I can definitely recommend playing Hibernated or the other games by Stefan Vogt. Also check out all the many other interactive fiction games or text adventures that are out there. There's a very big community, mostly of English text adventures, sometimes also different languages. But if you like adventure games, where you have to imagine all the stuff that you're reading, if you like reading books, this could be something for you. There are very excellent games here, and Hibernated is one fantastic example of that. A science fiction game where you're, in hypersleep and wake up and everything went haywire and you have to figure out what happened and how you could proceed. So let's go with starboard and see how that works. Disk is loading, obviously, and yeah, here we are in the lower corridor, flashing red warning lights, etc. Well, I can definitely say this is working. I don't think I feel much of a difference, as I said, but yeah, the SoftROM is definitely a great thing to increase your memory capacity of your pad by 25%. And currently there's basically only the Infocom interpreter that uses that. But who knows if people are willing to spend time on the pad and enhance other software as well. So there's that. A maxed out PET 3016 with 40K of RAM, which I didn't think it was possible, but it is possible. And you can even use it. You can play modern games and old games on it using a period correct floppy disk drive, which is, to be honest, a pain. So I would instead suggest getting one of these, the SD to PET. Because it's a really hassle to get this running. If you're really into that, yeah, go for it, get such a drive. You have to know these are 100 TPI drives, so only those can write their own disks. You can't use another disk drive for that. There's also the 4040, which is, I think, easier to write for because it's standard 48 tracks per inch. But the higher density disk drives are all 100 TPI for the PET, which is very rare compared to the standard high-density disk drives from PCs, 96 TPI. So bear that in mind. But it does work. I think it is a lot of fun. It gives you really nostalgic feelings. But for everyone else, I would suggest the SD to PET, which goes into the back, into the tape port, and the IEEE port. And it has a SD card in here. Yeah, get one of those. It's also faster still than this one, so playing the games will be easier on any of the pads. But if not, this is how you can do it. And yeah, I love it. I love the fact that you can play on a basically 70s machine quite complicated and sophisticated games. But that's it for today. Share, like, subscribe, leave a comment. Did you ever work on a pet? Did you have one? What are your feelings towards interactive fiction? Have you ever played any of those games? I can definitely recommend them. There are some very good ones also for introductory players, let's say. There are very complicated and hard ones. But for example, Hibernated 1 doesn't have any deaths, no dead ends or such scenarios. So this is definitely for people who never have played an interactive fiction game before. There's also a bit shorter game, Curse of Rabenstein, which doesn't run on the pad, but on many other platforms, which is even a bit simpler, I would say, and maybe for very much beginners, an excellent choice. Planetfall, again, is one of the classic Infocoms, and there were dozens of games by Infocom, and every year people do such games as Homebrew. So check those out, and I hope to see you in the next video.